A grief-stricken son interrupts his father's funeral and makes a shocking announcement. His father is still alive. While the mourners take it as denial, the boy's conviction leads to a horrifying revelation. Subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. The Harris estate stood at the end of a long, winding driveway, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and iron lanterns that flickered softly as the evening fell. The house itself, an elegant mix of modern architecture and classic Southern charm, loomed large against the backdrop of the sunset. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the warm glow of the sky, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. It was a house that spoke of wealth and success, an outward symbol of the life that Daniel Harris had built through years of hard work and sharp business acumen. Inside, the living room mirrored the grandeur of the exterior. Plush leather couches, a polished mahogany coffee table, and a large marble fireplace gave the space an air of sophistication. Photos adorned the walls, snapshots of vacations, birthdays, and candid moments captured between father and son. Most of them featured Amara, Daniel's late wife, whose warm smile and confident posture seemed to fill the room even in her absence. She had been the heart of the home, and her presence lingered in the carefully preserved details. Her favorite vase still on the mantel, the throw blanket she had knitted draped over the arm of the couch. Daniel sat at the dining table, dressed in a crisp shirt with the sleeves rolled up, sipping coffee as he went through paperwork. Across from him, his 10-year-old son, Elijah, sprawled out with a book open in front of him, though he wasn't reading. His pencil tapped against the table, and his eyes kept flicking up toward his father, waiting for an opening to speak. Elijah was small for his age, with bright, inquisitive eyes and a head full of tight curls. He had inherited Amara's sharp features and her knack for observation, traits that often made adults underestimate how much he understood. He had a love for puzzles and mystery novels, always eager to uncover hidden truths, something that would soon become far more than a hobby. "Dad?" he finally asked, setting his pencil down. Daniel looked up, giving his son his full attention, the way he always did. "Yeah, buddy. Do you think Mom would be mad?" Daniel's brows furrowed. "Mad about what?" Elijah hesitated, shifting in his seat. "About Miss Lillian." Daniel set his papers aside and leaned forward. "No, son. Your mom wanted us to be happy. She wouldn't want us to live the rest of our lives sad and alone." Elijah nodded slowly, but his expression remained clouded. He didn't doubt his father's love for Amara, but something about Lillian unsettled him. She was beautiful, sure, tall, with platinum blonde hair that curled at the ends and a smile that could charm anyone. She carried herself with elegance, as though she belonged in their world of wealth and influence. And yet, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't fit. He remembered the first time he met her. It was at a charity gala Daniel had hosted, a formal affair where everyone wore their best clothes and spoke in polite tones. Lillian had arrived in a red dress that turned heads, laughing lightly at Daniel's jokes and leaning in close when he spoke. She'd seemed perfect, too perfect. Their relationship moved fast. Within months, Daniel proposed, and Lillian moved into the house shortly after. She wasted no time in making changes. At first, it was little things, rearranging the furniture, swapping out artwork. Then it was bigger changes. She repainted Amara's favorite room, saying the darker tones were too gloomy. She packed up some of Amara's belongings, placing them in storage. "It's time to let go of the past," she told Daniel with a soft smile. Elijah hated those words. He didn't want to let go of his mom, and he didn't understand why they had to erase her to move forward. Even so, he tried to be polite. He watched Lillian carefully, looking for cracks in her perfect exterior, but she always seemed flawless. She cooked elaborate meals, planned outings, and even helped Elijah with his school projects. And yet, the uneasy feeling lingered. The first sign that something was wrong came late one night. Elijah woke to the sound of voices downstairs. It was past midnight, and the house was supposed to be quiet, but he could hear Lillian's voice, sharp and agitated. He crept down the stairs, peeking through the railing to see her standing in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. "I'm doing everything I can," she hissed. "You think this is easy? He trusts me completely." There was a long pause, and then her voice dropped lower. "No, not yet, but soon." Elijah's stomach twisted. He didn't know who she was talking to, but it didn't sound like the kind of conversation a loving wife would have. The next morning, he tried to bring it up to his father, but Daniel brushed it off. "She's under a lot of stress, Eli," he said. "Give her time to settle in." Elijah dropped it, but he didn't forget. The changes came gradually after that. Daniel, once full of energy, started complaining of headaches and fatigue. He brushed it off as work stress, but Elijah noticed how Lillian began taking over his routines, bringing him drinks, preparing his meals. She even convinced him to stop going to the gym, saying he needed rest instead. At first, Elijah thought she was just being caring. Then he noticed the bottles of pills in the medicine cabinet, pills that hadn't been there before. One evening, while helping Lillian clean up after dinner, Elijah saw her slip something into Daniel's drink. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but he caught it. He didn't say anything, not yet. He needed proof. As days passed, Daniel grew weaker. He started missing work, spending more time in bed. Lillian called doctors who diagnosed him with a rare neurological condition. They prescribed more medications, but nothing seemed to help. And through it all, Lillian smiled and comforted him, assuring him that she'd take care of everything. Elijah's unease turned to fear. He couldn't explain it, but he knew, deep down, that Lillian wasn't what she seemed. One night, while searching through the trash, he found empty pill bottles with labels that didn't match the prescriptions Daniel had been given. He stared at them, heart pounding. He wanted to tell his father, but Daniel was too sick to listen. Lillian had isolated him, making it impossible for anyone else to get close. And so Elijah waited. He watched. And he prepared. Because he knew, whatever was happening to his father, Lillian was at the center of it. The mornings in the Harris household had grown quieter, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension that now filled the air. Daniel's once commanding presence had faded, replaced by a shadow of the man he used to be. He moved slower, spoke softer, and spent more time in bed. The house, which had always felt alive with energy, now seemed suffocatingly still. Elijah noticed every change. He watched as his father's strong, athletic frame began to wither, his face losing its color and vitality. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and his voice had taken on a hoarse, distant quality. At first, Elijah blamed the stress of work and the adjustment to having Lillian in their lives. But as days turned into weeks, he realized it was something much more sinister. It started subtly. Lillian began taking control of Daniel's schedule, claiming it was to help him manage his health. She canceled his gym appointments, saying rest was more important. She insisted on preparing all his meals, often emphasizing the need for vitamins and supplements. She even arranged his medication schedule, making sure he never missed a dose. At first, Daniel welcomed the attention, grateful for the support. But Elijah saw the way his father's eyes sometimes flickered with doubt before he swallowed the pills Lillian handed him. One afternoon, Elijah overheard a conversation between Lillian and the family doctor. She had called him to discuss Daniel's condition, speaking in hushed tones. "I'm just so worried," she said, her voice trembling. "He's getting weaker every day, and nothing seems to help." The doctor offered reassurances, but Elijah caught something else in her voice, a performance, carefully controlled. When the call ended, she emerged from the study with a somber expression, but the corners of her lips twitched ever so slightly, as if suppressing a smile. Later that night, Elijah crept into the kitchen and searched through the trash. He found several empty bottles of pills, none of which matched the prescriptions Daniel's doctor had mentioned. The labels were foreign, the dosages unfamiliar. He pocketed one of the bottles, determined to figure out what was happening. Elijah's fear grew as Daniel's health continued to deteriorate. He began to sleep more, often drifting off in the middle of conversations. He would forget what he was saying mid-sentence, his thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. Lillian's response was always the same. "It's part of the condition," she said, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "We just have to be patient and trust the doctors." But Elijah didn't trust the doctors. Not anymore. One evening, he decided to confront her. He found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared tea. "What are you giving him?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lillian turned slowly, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "The pills, the drinks. What are you putting in them?" Her smile tightened. "Eli, I know this is hard for you, but you need to trust me. I love your father, and I'm doing everything I can to help him." Elijah didn't believe her, but he didn't have the proof he needed to stop her. The breaking point came a week later. Daniel collapsed during dinner. His body went rigid, and his breathing became shallow. Lillian screamed, grabbing the phone to call 911, but Elijah saw the flicker of something else in her eyes. Calculation. By the time the paramedics arrived, Daniel was unconscious. Lillian wept as they loaded him into the ambulance, clutching his hand and whispering words of love. But Elijah noticed how quickly she composed herself when no one was looking. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what Lillian had already predicted. Daniel had slipped into a coma. They ran tests and concluded that his condition was the result of a rare neurological disorder, one that had likely been developing for months. Elijah wanted to scream. He wanted to grab the doctors and tell them they were wrong, that this wasn't natural. But no one would listen to a 10-year-old boy. Lillian took over completely after that. She met with lawyers, finalized paperwork, and announced that Daniel's estate would be transferred into her care until further notice. She even began discussing funeral arrangements, despite the fact that Daniel was still alive. "He wouldn't want to suffer," she said, her voice heavy with practiced grief. "If he doesn't wake up, we need to be prepared." Elijah was horrified. He felt helpless as Lillian moved through the house like a queen, dismissing staff and shutting out visitors. She had effectively isolated him, ensuring that no one could question her decisions. But Elijah refused to give up. One night, while Lillian was out meeting with the family lawyer, he snuck into her office. He rifled through drawers and cabinets, searching for anything that could prove his suspicions. In the bottom drawer, he found a locked box. After several tense minutes, he managed to pry it open with a screwdriver. Inside, he found receipts for large purchases, property transfers, stocks, and offshore accounts, all made in Lillian's name. There were also handwritten notes detailing Daniel's decline and instructions for handling his assets, But it was the last item that made Elijah's blood run cold. A small, unlabeled vial filled with a dark liquid. Elijah stared at it, his hands shaking. He knew now, without a doubt, that Lillian had been poisoning his father, but he still didn't know how to stop her. When Lillian returned home that night, she found Elijah sitting at the dining table, staring at the vial. "What's that?" she asked, her voice sharp. He looked up at her, his eyes blazing with anger. "You did this," he said. For the first time, her mask slipped. Her lips curled into a smirk and her eyes hardened. "And what are you going to do about it?" Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he clenched the vial in his hand, silently vowing that he wouldn't let her win. The next morning, Lillian announced that the funeral would take place at the end of the week. Elijah knew he was running out of time. The day of the funeral arrived beneath an overcast sky, heavy with the weight of impending rain. The Harris estate, usually filled with light and laughter, had transformed into a somber hall of mourning. The living room, cleared of its usual furniture, now held rows of black chairs and a polished mahogany casket resting at the center. White lilies and roses surrounded it, their fragrance thick and oppressive. Elijah stood near the door, dressed in a black suit that felt too big for his small frame. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the murmurs of the guests who trickled in. They whispered condolences to Lillian, who stood near the casket, her expression a masterpiece of controlled grief. She wore a fitted black dress and a veil that obscured her face just enough to hide the lack of tears. Elijah's stomach churned as he watched her. He had barely slept in the days leading up to the funeral, haunted by the knowledge of what she had done. But he still had no proof, nothing he could show the police or the doctors to make them believe him. The vial he had found had mysteriously disappeared from his room the morning after he confronted Lillian, and she had made sure he was too closely watched to go searching for more evidence. Now, as he stood among strangers who saw his father as a dead man, Elijah felt the walls closing in. He wanted to scream, to tear open the casket and show them all that his father wasn't gone. But who would believe him? The ceremony began with a soft hum of organ music. The minister stepped forward, offering words of comfort and reflection. He spoke of Daniel's generosity, his dedication to family, and his legacy of success. Lillian dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her shoulders shaken just enough to draw sympathetic glances. Elijah felt sick watching her performance. When it was time for the family to approach the casket, he followed reluctantly as Lillian led the way. She placed a single red rose on the polished wood, whispering something that only she could hear. Then she turned and gently pushed Elijah forward. "Say goodbye, sweetheart," she murmured. Elijah stared at the casket, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room on him, waiting for him to break down in tears like a grieving son should. But instead, he took a step back. "No," he said, his voice shaken but loud enough to cut through the silence. Lillian froze, her smile faltering. "Elijah," she said softly, warningly, but he ignored her. "He's not dead." Gasps rippled through the room. "He's alive," Elijah shouted, pointing at the casket. "She did something to him. She's lying." The room erupted into chaos. Guests began murmuring, some looking at Lillian with doubt, others reaching out to calm Elijah. Lillian's face paled, but she quickly recovered, wrapping an arm around Elijah and forcing a laugh. "He's in shock," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "He hasn't accepted it yet. It's been so hard on him." Elijah pushed her away, tears streaming down his face. "You poisoned him." The words hit like a slap, silencing the room. Lillian's eyes darkened. "That's enough," she snapped, dropping the gentle act. "Elijah, you're embarrassing yourself. Your father is gone, and it's time you faced it." But Elijah wasn't listening. He turned and ran out of the room, pushing past the guests and out into the garden. He collapsed onto a bench, his chest heaving. Tears blurred his vision, and for the first time, he felt completely alone. He didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. Lillian's voice broke through the stillness. "You've caused enough trouble, Elijah." He looked up to see her standing over him, her expression cold and unreadable. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said, "but you've left me no choice." Before he could react, she grabbed his arm and yanked him to his feet. Her nails dug into his skin as she pulled him toward the house. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" she hissed. "You're just a scared little boy who doesn't know how to let go." Elijah struggled, but her grip was iron. When they reached the back door, she shoved him inside and locked it behind them. "You'll stay here until the funeral's over," she said, "and by then it won't matter what you say." She turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the darkened room. But Elijah wasn't done. He knew there was still time, still a chance to save his father. He searched the room, looking for anything he could use to escape. Finally, he found a fire poker near the fireplace and used it to break the lock. He sprinted through the house, his heart pounding. By the time he reached the funeral hall, most of the guests had left. The casket was being prepared for transport, and Lillian was speaking with the funeral director. "Elijah?" she said, startled as he burst into the room. But he didn't stop. He ran straight to the casket and began pulling at the lid. "Stop him!" Lillian shrieked, but the few remaining guests hesitated, unsure what to do. With one final push, Elijah forced the lid open. Gasps filled the room. Daniel lay inside, pale but breathing. His chest rose and fell faintly, and his lips were slightly parted. "He's alive!" Elijah cried, turning to the stunned crowd. "He's not dead!" The funeral director immediately called for an ambulance, and paramedics arrived within minutes. Lillian tried to stop them, but Elijah pointed at her. "She did this! She poisoned him!" This time, people listened. Police arrived, and as Daniel was rushed to the hospital, Lillian was taken into custody. Elijah watched as she was led away, her perfect mask shattered. She hissed threats at him as they pushed her into the car, but he didn't flinch. He had won, and now all that mattered was saving his father. The hospital room was sterile and quiet, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor that filled the space. Daniel Harris lay motionless in the bed, his face pale and hollow, but his chest rose and fell, proof of life. Elijah sat beside him, his small hand resting on his father's larger one, unwilling to let go. Days had passed since the funeral, but Elijah's memories of that moment still burned vividly. The gasps, the chaos, the sight of his father lying in that casket, alive but helpless, haunted him every time he closed his eyes. But now, as he sat by his father's side, those memories mixed with hope. Daniel was alive. He was here, and Elijah had saved him. The doctors worked tirelessly to reverse the damage caused by the drugs that had kept Daniel in a near comatose state. It wasn't poison in the traditional sense, but a carefully calculated cocktail of sedatives and muscle relaxants designed to mimic neurological failure. The truth of it was almost worse than poison. It was a deliberate, prolonged assault that drained him day by day. The lead doctor assured Elijah that his father's recovery was likely, though it would take time. The sedatives had left his muscles weak and his body uncoordinated. But with therapy, he could regain most of his strength. For Elijah, time moved painfully slow. He barely left the hospital, sleeping in a chair beside the bed and eating only when the nurses insisted. Every day, he watched for signs of movement, for some flicker of recognition in his father's face. The nurses whispered about him, calling him brave, but Elijah didn't feel brave. He felt scared. Scared that his father might never wake up completely. Scared that the damage Lillian had done might be permanent. The police visited several times, asking questions and gathering evidence. They wanted Elijah's testimony, but he struggled to explain everything. He told them about the pills, the locked box, and the phone conversations he'd overheard. He described how Lillian slowly isolated his father, controlling every aspect of his life. As the investigation continued, the true extent of Lillian's deception came to light. She had drained accounts, forged signatures, and transferred properties into her name. Her entire relationship with Daniel had been a calculated move to exploit his wealth and status. Worse, investigators uncovered connections between Lillian and a group notorious for targeting successful black families through fraud and manipulation. The discovery fueled Elijah's anger. It wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Lillian's actions were rooted in something deeper than greed. Her disdain for Daniel's success, her subtle jabs at his background, and her desire to erase Amara's memory painted a clear picture of her views. The media picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about trust and exploitation. But for Elijah, it wasn't about headlines or public sympathy. It was about justice. 3 weeks after the funeral, Daniel opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Elijah's face, and despite the weakness in his body, he managed a faint smile. Tears welled in Elijah's eyes as he gripped his father's hand. "You're back," Elijah whispered. Daniel's voice was barely more than a rasp. "You saved me." In the days that followed, Daniel's recovery became the focus of their lives. Physical therapy sessions were grueling, but Elijah never left his side. He read books aloud, played music Daniel liked, and reminded him of the life waiting for him outside the hospital walls. Daniel's progress was slow but steady. Each small victory, standing with support, taking a few steps, eating solid food, felt monumental. The bond between father and son grew stronger with each hurdle they overcame together. Meanwhile, Lillian's trial moved forward. Her defense tried to paint her as a grieving wife, who had simply made bad decisions in a moment of desperation. But the evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from former associates revealed her history of manipulation and deceit. Her cold demeanor in court only solidified the jury's view of her guilt. The verdict was swift. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud, attempted manslaughter, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Elijah didn't attend the sentencing. He didn't want to see her again. Instead, he sat with his father, who had finally returned home. The house felt different now, lighter, freer. Lillian's influence had been scrubbed away, replaced by a sense of safety and renewal. But the scars remained. Elijah struggled to trust people, always questioning their motives. He flinched at sudden noises and had nightmares about being locked away, unable to save his father. Daniel carried his own burdens. The betrayal cut deep, and the months spent powerless left him grappling with feelings of shame and vulnerability. Together, they began to rebuild. Daniel hired a therapist for both of them, encouraging Elijah to talk about what had happened. He also started working with organizations that supported black entrepreneurs, using his experience to help others protect themselves from similar schemes. Elijah threw himself into school and hobbies, channeling his emotions into art and writing. He even started working on a story about a boy detective who uncovered secrets and saved his family, an outlet for the trauma he wasn't ready to fully process. The house slowly filled with laughter again. Friends and family visited often, bringing food and encouragement, and when Elijah's birthday rolled around, Daniel threw a celebration that reminded everyone how far they had come. As the months passed, the nightmares grew less frequent. Elijah began to trust again, though he remained more cautious than most kids his age. He no longer saw his curiosity as just a hobby. It was a tool, a strength that had saved his father's life. One evening, Elijah and Daniel sat on the porch, watching the sunset over their property. The air was warm, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. "Do you ever wonder why she did it?" Elijah asked softly. Daniel was silent for a moment before answering. "People like her don't see us as equals," he said. "They see what we've built and think we don't deserve it, but they're wrong." Elijah nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We're stronger than they think," he said. Daniel smiled, squeezing his son's hand. "Yes, we are." And as the sun dipped below the trees, casting golden light across the lawn, Elijah felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer defined him. He was ready to face whatever came next. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel not to miss new stories. Share this video with your friends. Maybe they will be as surprised as you are. Watch other videos on the channel. There are more exciting stories to come.